Days after the attack and abduction of 42 students, staff, and their relatives at the Government Science College in Kagara, rumors of the abductees' release have caused anxiety amongst Nigerians, resulting in contradictory solutions to the nation's insecurity challenges. While the Sultan of Sokoto believes Boko Haram insurgents have Indy, could you help me out, please?
Yeah, Haram insurgents have transmuted into bandits and should be treated as such. Well, the National Assembly is seeking amnesty for all the bandits. Joining us now to speak on this is counter-terrorism specialist David Otto. David, glad to have you join us.
Thank you very much.
Good, fantastic. David, let's start it this way. Now, the attack on Kagara is coming 2 months after the attack on Kankara, where about 350 boys were kidnapped and rescued by security agents. It's usually said that once beaten, twice shy. One would think that the security agencies would have wised up to the tactics and antics and strategies of these bandits. What's your own thinking?
I think that is the general thinking. You've cited the recent Kagara kidnapping of 42 plus individuals. I can tell you from unconfirmed reports that there was another kidnapping just in Madari, which is just a few kilometers away from Kagara in the same Niger state. These kidnappings that we've seen, as you mentioned, the Kankara boys, there before, you had the Dapchi, and which was originally followed, which preceded the Chibok girls kidnapping. So this is not something which is new to the security services. And again, as you rightly mentioned, the expectation would have been after the Chibok kidnap that this shouldn't happen again. But it does appear as if there has been a collapse of law enforcement. This is not primarily a military role. The Nigerian police force is there to protect the lives and properties of citizens who carry out their daily activities. Now, if these kidnaps are happening at mass and randomly every day, then the basic social contract of peace, security, and freedom is at serious threat. And that is why you can see lots of organizations, including the Senate and others, are calling for some kind of a state of emergency. That is not to say that would bring about a solution, but this is an indication of the frustration which many people are expressing, in regards to these incidents of violence. So I think the government really needs to come up with a strategy. I know that we've talked about this. So many experts have talked about what needs to be done, but it does seem as if the solution is far-fetched in terms of practice. So this is what is expected of the government, to really dive into the practicalities of this.
I mean, you touched on, before your answer moved on to a solution, I was going to first ask you about responsibility, since you said that more than this being a military issue, it's about police and other types of state apparatus in terms of responsibility. So I guess I'll start there. First and foremost, if we're talking about responsibility, surely when we look at these examples of insecurity, of kidnappings across Nigeria, especially directed and concentrating in the northern part of the country, it does seem as though there's a lot of blame to go around. So where would you say the lion's share of that blame starts?
The lion's share of the blame has to be shared by the state authorities. Nigeria, the administrative responsibility goes first with the state. Of course, the federal government is responsible for policing. But I think the chief security officer of the state are the governors, and they have the primary responsibility to protect their citizens. So I think if you have the state authorities actually getting to grips, and understand what kind of measures, can be put in place to secure their states, that will be a good step. Now, they have to work with the federal government and make a decision as to, how policing is carried out. Let me give you an example. In the United Kingdom, for example, which by no means one should compare, but it's good to have a look at the system of policing. It is based on the community, and whereby the police in a state, for example, are being controlled by the federal government, it becomes far-fetched from the local situation. So I think the lion's share should be shared between the state and the federal government. But it is the responsibility of the chief security officers, of the governors, to ensure that their citizens are being kept safely, they are not being kidnapped. So they have to push for a community or a state policing, which they can have control of. If the federal government is failing to execute these services, I know of examples where police officers are called upon in a kidnap scenario, and they simply refuse to go because they themselves are being kidnapped at mass by these bandits. So it's a complete I think you need an overhaul of the security architecture, and a change of strategy, which has to be decided by both the state authorities and the federal government.
Now, David, we had a retired AIG on our program here this week. I can't quite get his name now. If I remember it, I'll come up with it. But he says the nomenclatures, Felix Obaudi, I remember, the nomenclatures, Boko Haram, bandits, kidnappers, and so on, are to him semantics, because all engage in what he called, or what we know are criminal activities, and then disruption of the society. The question is, how do you really differentiate between these varied groups and deal with them in the light of what is happening in Nigeria now?
I think, yes, there may be semantics. If you want to look at their modus operandi in terms of how they carry out these attacks, they are the same. But the rationale behind the attacks are different. So, for example, while the Kagara kidnapping and also the current Kagara kidnap is exclusively that of bandits who are interested in monetary gains, the Chibok girls was not just about money. It was an ideological component to it. So even though one may want to see some similarities in operations, but the rationale behind these kidnappings are very different. So you can't really paint them in the same picture in terms of approaching a solution to these activities that are being carried out by both bandits and criminals. Remember that even if let me give you an example of the Leah Sharibu case, which has been hanging for a very long time. It is not the reluctance of the government to pay ransom that is holding back someone like Leah Sharibu, but it is the reluctance of the terrorists to release her on the basis of some religious ideology that she failed to convert to Islam. So if it were criminals, and the government, was ready to sacrifice for her release, by paying any kind of ransom or any deal to secure her release, then she would have been released. So it is not mere semantics, in terms of trying to, place the criminals and terrorists in the same box, from an ideological perspective, but from an operational perspective, they carry out the same kind of activities. So we've got to differentiate them depending on which area we're focusing on.
Right. You talked about schools there, but maybe we should talk about schools a little bit. one of the students, or let's go this way, what do you really make of this sudden, seemingly continuous attack on schools, Kagara? What is the message that this group of people are passing to Nigeria, to the bandits, to the world?
I think the message that they are passing is very simple, that there is a considerably lack of protection for critical infrastructures, including schools in Nigeria, and in most of the areas that they carry out these kidnappings. Remember that they select these locations very, very strategically, because they would survey them and understand the obvious weaknesses that do exist. They would measure the firepower, the response time of the security services, and then launch these attacks. So it is a very clear message to the world, which they are trying to push a narrative that if children cannot be secured in schools, then the future of the Nigerian generation it's at risk. Education is supposed to be the foundation of every citizen of Nigeria, and if you cannot, be seen to, have some security in terms of, you getting that education, then the future is collapsing. So these bandits or terrorists, as you mentioned, for example, in the case of Dapchi and the Chibok girls, were clearly saying that the Western system of education, should not continue. They want an Islamic form of education based on their extreme ideologies, not, according to other Muslims, not the true version of Islam. Now, this is an argument between, one side and the other side of what that really means. But if children cannot go to school because of insecurity, then it sends a very bad message to not just Nigerians, but to the entire world that, the whole system, is under threat. So I think the government really needs to look into this and come up with a solid and sustainable answer. Rhetorics and meetings and conferences, talk shows or analysis of this nature may just help. But you still need to implement these strategies on ground.
Naturally, at a time like this, you can imagine that when we are experiencing such a high number or recurring number of examples of insecurity, kidnapping, and the like, naturally people would call on the government for protection, because that is first and foremost the responsibility, most especially for holders of elected office. So when we are aware of that, I'm sure you'd be quite surprised to hear earlier this week that the Nigerian Minister for Defense, who is a former soldier himself, said that, when it comes to banditry, people should stand up and defend themselves against bandits who've turned kidnapping into a thriving business. First and foremost, you can imagine that it does feel as a slap in the face to many civilians who are quite literally terrorized in their own homes to hear a minister say such a thing. What are your thoughts on those comments he made? Actually, before I throw to you for your answer, it is time for us to take a short break. And when we come back, we will continue our discussion with Mr. David Otto on Nigeria's insecurity. Stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We are still joined by counter-terrorism expert David Otto. Welcome to the show. Thank you for staying with us, Mr. Otto. Before we went on break there, I was asking you about your thoughts on the Nigerian Minister for Defense, Major General Bashir Magashi, who earlier this week said that Nigerians had to stand up to bandits who are using kidnapping as a means of business. What are your thoughts on those comments?
First of all, the right to self-defense is a universal right. People have the right to defend themselves in certain conditions. The Nigerian law makes it very clear as to what level of force and what proportion of force should be used. But I think the general has to be very cautious about how you ask people to defend themselves, because I can tell you that these kind of narratives is one of the narratives which some of these bandits are using to say that they are defending their territory. There is general insecurity. We've seen these rhetorics being used by so-called herders and farmers in clashes that have occurred on the basis of self-defense. In a situation which is very rare, in my experience, in many countries, to hear of law enforcement officers being kidnapped, one needs to be very cautious the way you promote or preach the use of arms by citizens for the purpose of self-defense. I think the general means well, perhaps in calling for people to protect themselves because of the obvious insecurity in some parts of the country. But a blanket call for people to protect themselves, is one that would crush down the existing law enforcement authorities. And that is a very dangerous rhetoric, especially in the context of Nigeria. I think what needs to be done instead of or before one calls for people to defend themselves is to make it very clear how they should be able to do that and how they can work with the existing Nigerian police force when, of course, it is reformed. Because, we talked about some months ago on the issues of NSAS and how other police force units have been incapacitated in carrying out their duties. I think the president himself has, pushed for the police reforms to be very swift. I think this is what is required at this point in time for that to really happen. Other than, calling for citizens to defend themselves without actually prescribing how they should be able to do that. What Nigeria doesn't want is a situation where everybody carries arms. And this is exactly what is happening now if you look at the trend of kidnapping, where it is now difficult to stop, so-called bandits or terrorists from carrying random kidnaps left, right, and center. So caution is my take on that.
Caution, your take on that, David. Somewhere in our discussion, you talked about ransom. On the front page of this day newspapers, which I have here with me, the governor is rejecting 500 million ransom demand as bandits cling to Kagara schoolboys. Now, both the governor of Niger State and Gumi said government should resist giving out ransom to the herdsmen, that instead they should concentrate on provision of hospitals, basic amenities like schools, water, clinics, job creation. How does this resonate with you? How do you handle this question of ransom? It's like being between the devil and the deep blue sea, because you have to get back these boys. The people are asking for ransom. You don't want to pay ransom because when you pay ransom, they go get more AK-47 or these ammunitions to continue to carry on with their dastardly act. So as a security expert, terrorism specialist, how do you manage this? How do you handle this? How do you, please?
Let me tell you how I handle it. My experience is very clear. If you don't want to pay ransom, then don't allow people to be kidnapped by bandits. So the first responsibility of every state that doesn't want to pay ransom is to ensure that its citizens are not being kidnapped by bandits or terrorists. Immediately you allow your citizens to be kidnapped in this manner, then talk of ransom should be on the table. Because if it's my son, my sister, my brother, or your son, or their sons, you want them to be released, irrespective of the demands that the rebels or the criminals or the terrorists are making, because you failed to prevent them from taking them in the first place. So that is my standard advice to every government that says, we don't pay ransom to terrorists or criminals. And I say to them, then you don't allow your citizens to be kidnapped or captured by them. The life of every citizen is sacrosanct. It has to be protected by all means, by any means, by the state. If the state has to retain its control and the trust from the citizens, we shouldn't bring in rhetorics that are being used by Western states, on the front of the newspaper, but they do something else, at the background. So this is my advice to the Nigerian government. Indeed the Niger State, governor, if the bandits are asking for 500 million naira, then you should find a negotiator. People like the sheikh, these are facilitators. They can give you access because of their repute. They can talk to these bandits, but when it comes to negotiation, it shouldn't just be the Secretary of State for the government or the sheikh that should be talking to them. They should find somebody who has the expertise and somebody who can negotiate for the release of these captives, irrespective of what they're asking for. That can be negotiated. So my advice is negotiate because you failed to prevent the kidnap in the first place.
Let me follow up before Femi comes in on Gumi. What do you make of what he's been doing, his efforts? And then, of course, he's been getting into this forest. In fact, he had a meeting with the governor that was just showed there a while ago, Bello, and he even gave Gumi his SSG, secretary to the state government, to go into the forest, Dutse Magadi forest, to talk with this tourist. What do you make of the efforts of Gumi? And, he's talking about dialogue, rather than, because he says that government seems to have failed in their capacity to protect lives and property. All right. I think I'm going to have to keep you on pause. Hold on.
You can answer.
Hold on. Okay, go on. But just to let you know that you might not end your thought because we're going to go on a break, but continue. We'll call for a break and you'll continue after the break. I hope that's okay.
That's all right. Yes, dialogue is a process. It's not itself a solution. Dialogue means talking to these bandits, and it's always important to have somebody who have access to them, irrespective of the morality of the population or the people in regards to that. People like the sheikh are very important because they can create you access. But access itself is one win. The biggest win is actually getting to have a proper negotiation with somebody who has the skills to do that and ensure that a release is maintained. Now, in terms of whether dialogue is the solution, it's not. It's just the opening of a process towards negotiations. And again, in order for you to negotiate, you've got to have the skills for it. Morality alone or religious savviness is a psychological aspect. It doesn't work when it comes to bandits that have probably invested their lives and time to carry out this kidnapping. So, the government needs to really make sure that these things don't happen. So we don't really get into these processes, which are very, very ineffective at best, but necessary, at worst.
Agreed. Thank you, David. It is time for us to go on a short break, and when we come back, we will continue on this conversation with David Otto. Please do stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still joined by counter-terrorism specialist David Otto. David, thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying with us. If I were to ask you, do you think a holistic approach has a place in tackling this extremist problem Nigeria seems to have? Do you think that the government can be both tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, so that could be a way to bring down the amount of attacks that we're seeing? Do you think that a holistic approach has a place here in counterterrorism?
A holistic approach is it's very necessary in terms of structure, but from an operations perspective, I think we should be looking at an approach that is based on the 36 states and the 6 geopolitical zones. Each state may be experiencing similar serious organized crime. They may be experiencing similar types of insurgency or terrorism. But I think it's important to always fashion your strategy, at a using the local dynamics. The multi-agency approach is very important. Of course, you need to have a combination of the civil society working very closely with INGOs, the Nigerian Police Force, Civil Defense Force, the Nigerian Army, the intelligence services, of course, which is very crucial when it comes to information gathering and dissemination. I think from my own experience, it's much more effective when the government has, or the federal government in this case, has a federal approach, or what some other countries will call a national approach. But then the national approach, has to be based on each state coming up with its own peculiar strategy to deal with this. Nigeria currently has what they call the NAC test, which is the Nigerian counterterrorism strategy. They should also have a Nigerian security strategy, which, of course, should come from the Office of the National Security Advisor. And then that should be disseminated to the various security agencies. So the best way is to always say that there is a holistic approach. But in terms of how that is implemented, it's much more effective when each state can develop its own national strategy, thereby understanding the dynamics that happen within the state and ensure that they can have the necessary resources, the necessary checks and balances within the state to crack down on crime and criminality. Strategies that are general are good when you're talking outside your country, but when you're implementing them, it's always better when you take them to the local level.
Yeah. Let's look at two leaders and what they are saying. First is the former president, Abdul Salami Abubakar. He says he's urging Nigerians to stop trading blames, but rather focus on ending the current ethnic clashes. Now, the leader of APC says don't turn security challenges to ethnic, tribal, religious crisis. I'm talking about Tinubu. So what role should politicians, opinion molders, traditional rulers, and community leaders be playing concerning security and even the ethnic clashes?
Everybody has to play a role, irrespective of whether you're a politician or you're a community leader. But more importantly, they have to play even a much more visible role. And their role doesn't just have to be a blame game, a role of, talking about some of the, the issues which have been faced, but much more looking to profile effective solutions. These are people who have experience in governance. My experience also is that politicians are rarely security specialists, except for those that have some security background. So there is that often a clash between leaders that have been in power before, talking about insecurity of leaders that are currently in power, sometimes, to demonstrate their own capacity and capability. But when one reflects back to when they were on the driving seat, you'd realize that the vehicle was also, crashing. So I think what is more important here is to realize that rhetorics alone do not solve insecurity. I think what resolves it is all hands on deck, irrespective of whether you are a politician or whether you're a citizen of the country. What Nigerians must really understand is that insecurity in one part of the country will not spare the other part. And the more people are aware that playing a positive role in terms of not just the narratives that you put out there, but also how you disseminate the information about the situations that happen within your own local area to the authorities.
What then do you...
And I use that very carefully because...
What then do you say
yes,
about...
and I use that very carefully.
Go on.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. What then do you say about, again, I bring in the AIG, the former AIG, Felix Obotu. You know, he was talking about if you hear something, say something. If you see something, say something. I said this in relation to the fact that from the stories gathered, this operation in Kagara took place, the span was about 3 hours. They came in on foot, left on foot, and there was no information to the security agencies, or the security agencies didn't get to know until after 3 hours. So is it a question of, you know, this communication, not being able, because he was saying that people should participate, you're talking about citizens, on the level that they should give the security agencies information, they should talk, they should speak. What's your sense?
I'll tell you very well that the say something, see something, it's a very important rhetoric. There has to be an established line of communication, because if you say something, if you see something and say something, who are you saying that something to? What medium are you using to channel that information? And who is checking to make sure that the information that has been disseminated is actually accurate, but also that it's been followed up by these security officers or the people that are in charge. You've got to remember that Nigeria is a very big country, of course, not just in terms of size, but population, more than 200 million. It means if the security services are receiving information every minute, then they've got to make sure that they have some kind of capacity to check that information and, you know, take action immediately. I will tell you that there are so many instances where information has been released and sent to security officials, but they somehow simply do not believe that information, or you know, they don't have the capacity to deploy at that specific time to the location in question. So it comes down to each country having a structure, each state having a structure that will allow for the locals to disseminate information to a particular structure within that state, and that state having the capacity to deal with that information, you know, within its state. So that is where I talked about the issue of state-centric security, rather than having the power or the responsibility lie exclusively with the federal government. So it's all about structure. It can be done. It has been done in other countries. Nigeria has the human and material capacity to do it, but somehow, you know, it's not seen as a priority, because insecurity itself sometimes, you know, creates a situation where politicians are seen as being required by the people, and they use that as a forum to request, you know, for this is what we're going to do when you vote for us. So the people need to hold the government to account, and they need to do that peacefully and in a very robust manner.
Fantastic. David Otto, who is a counterterrorism specialist, thank you very much for your time.